think I take this more from a strict greenhouse gas lens. Most of my work is in energy policy, but this was a really nice opportunity to really further dive into the things that we're doing in waste management on Oahu. And I wanted to give you a little bit of that broader context for some of the challenges, but also opportunities of island economies in this space. So Hawaii has a very ambitious target to become carbon net negative by the year 2045. This was a policy passed in 2018, very much in in the political movement of President Trump coming in and saying we're going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and then U.S. states taking a stand and saying no, we are still going to meet these commitments, even if we have to do it at a state level. So Hawaii was amongst a handful of U.S. states who passed similar legislation at the time, really pushing back on kind of the change in federal tone in regards to Paris. So it's a very, ambitious goal. It's a very, informed by climate science goal, right? We know we need to have deep decarbonization by mid-century in order to stave off the worst of warming. And I think for Hawaii as a Pacific island, we're also very attuned to really thinking about the 1.5 target in terms of the impacts of sea level rise to our neighbors in Oceania. And so, this is the policy framework by which much of our thinking about carbon reduction has been framed. And it is one of those cases where it was, it's based in climate science. There was a political moment for it. And afterwards in 2018, people went, oh, how are we going to do that? What are our greenhouse gas emissions? Where are we at, right? And so those are kind of the policy discussions moving forward. And so this is the profile of Hawaii's greenhouse gas emissions. And this is at a statewide level. This is a project that my research group within the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience works with ICF, a consulting company called ICF, and our State Department of Health to deliver annually. ICF works on the inventory, and my research group within ISR works on thinking about greenhouse gas emissions in the future. What are our trends? So this is the years for which we have official inventories, and we actually just kicked off this week our kind of next round of work where we're getting the 2022 inventory up and going. And you can see that for the years in which we have full inventories, 2007 is when our emissions peaked. They have gone down slightly since then, but it is really slight, right? We're definitely not on a path of deep decarbonization. You can see the COVID year of 2020 is our lowest. This is what, the huge reductions basically in air travel is what accounts for that. And we have basically a rebound since. Most of our emissions are within the energy sector. So as I said, this is where a lot of my work is situated, is thinking about the energy transition. And waste sector emissions are the orange line there. It's relatively small, right? But we still need to dig into that because it's small but very important, as you all know. Let's see. So waste sector emissions are 2%. Can you all see my cursor when I scroll? Okay, great. Waste sector emissions are 2% of the total. This is in 2021. Energy sector emissions are, of course, the huge piece of this. And here we have industrial processes, and this is APRU is an acronym basically for land use, right? So changes in land use, and this would be the sources. And the other figure also had the sink. So because energy is our largest sources of emissions, carbon dioxide is the largest greenhouse gas. And this accounts for global warming potential, and it's still carbon dioxide here. And you can see that methane, which is, of course, very linked to the waste sector in general, is about 3.5%. So in terms of our, that large chunk of the pie, right? Energy is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. That's basically split between transportation and electricity. And then transportation is split between ground transportation and air transportation. And these are relatively even splits. So electricity is a huge portion of our greenhouse gas emissions. And it's, I wanted to focus on this a little bit because the intersection to the waste sector is really important here. from a land management perspective and a waste management perspective and an energy perspective. So the vast majority of our electricity is created by burning oil in Hawaii. So as you'd imagine, this is also very expensive. It's very price volatile. So there are multiple kind of economic consequences in addition to the greenhouse gas consequences of burning oil. We've had a lot of push for renewable energy, and we have increasing sources from distributed solar, as well as utility solar. About 6% of our electricity is now from wind projects. We do have the geothermal on Hawaii Island. And biomass here is a bit of a misnomer. This is our waste to energy power that basically comes from the island of Oahu. So kind of from our most populated island, is roughly 1 million people here. Almost all of our solid waste from residential and commercial activities are burned for electricity generation. And that's where this comes from. So from that perspective, we actually have a pretty circular loop there, right? In terms of waste generation into the electric sector. So in terms of where we think our emissions are heading moving forward, this is a projection of the prior figure you saw, moving towards 2045. And largely we expect, because of our renewable portfolio standard and kind of the big state push for renewable energy for electricity generation, we expect to see the most reduction come from our stationary combustion, so from our electricity. This is basically the substitution of that big petroleum part of that circle, right, for wind and solar. And so as those projects come online, we expect that to decline. In terms of our transportation sector, our projections are that it stays relatively flat. There's a little bit of decline from the ground transportation sector in our models, basically from the turnover of private cars and trucks with our federal fuel efficiency standards. As we get more efficient cars and trucks on the road, we expect a small decline in ground transportation. But that takes a long time, right? It's a very slow policy tool. And this is good and bad from a waste perspective, because about 5% of cars are new on the road every year. So a similar percent are sort of junked in a year as well, right? And so that turnover rate makes the fuel efficiency kind of a slow policy mechanism. So that's what we expect in the future. And you can see, of course, these orange bars are relatively small as a total of 3%. As a relative number, of course, it becomes more meaningful over time. But there are still actions we can take to lessen that. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So where are we in terms of this broad picture of getting to carbon net negative, right? Well, we're pretty far, right? So even in terms of the big chunks, we still have a lot of work to do. Our ground transportation emissions, as I said, are declining just very, very slowly. So we need a lot of intervention there, both at federal and state levels, to make that happen. Air transportation is a huge component. So a switch to something like sustainable aviation fuels, which would be more in line with international and to some extent national policy, would also make a big difference. And that's what these whisker bars represent, is some of our scenario analysis of like, what if we did have other types of trends, right? Like particularly sustainable aviation fuels coupled with more aggressive renewable energy and electric vehicle adoption. That's what gets you in our models to something closer to here, right? So much closer to carbon neutral, but there's still a gap, right? So anyways, all to say, we have a lot of work to do. Emissions are declining, but not rapidly enough to meet the needs of the climate crisis. And so far, what I've presented is a very traditional production-based greenhouse gas inventory, right? These emissions are the emissions that occur in the borders of a jurisdiction, right? So this is emissions that, either are combusted within the state's boundaries, or for let's say aviation, right? It is refueled within the state's boundaries, even if not necessarily combusted within. So this is a production-based approach, and they're really good tools, but we have to understand the limits of these tools, right? So a production-based approach is generally taken, and it's kind of historically been taken, one, because it's, much easier to measure, right? It's easier to account for what happens in your area. And then two, when there, if we think about, a long ways back now in terms of the Kyoto Protocol, if we thought about there being a robust emissions trading scheme set up internationally at that point, which was the goal, which was what was established, right? Had that been set up, and everybody was doing production-based emissions inventories and pricing their carbon emissions or their greenhouse gas emissions through that, then we would have had true or closer to true pricing in our consumption as well, right? If there is a real global effort, then this is a pretty functional tool to get at both your own production as well as your own consumption. Without that global effort, without that global pricing, we lack that, right? And so there have been really interesting efforts to get at this, what's called a consumption-based inventory, right? To understand our consumption, embodied emissions within our consumption patterns. And as I said, it's very interesting and it's very challenging, which is what makes it so interesting. But this is a figure from Portland, Oregon's Climate Action Plan. And I really, this figure is used a lot to explain consumption-based emissions because it's a good one. And what you can see here, this is what's captured in a production approach, right? This is what they're saying is produced in Portland, Oregon, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. This part is their estimate of what is exported from Portland and then consumed elsewhere, right? And this part is what's imported into Portland and then consumed in Portland, right? So by taking a production approach, which would be this circle, you're missing all of this, right? Which is your embodied carbon of all the goods that you consume that's been imported into your area. So ideally, given that, we're not necessarily working off of a global carbon pricing scheme, we'd really want to have a sense of what this is and then be able to have policies that get to this as well, right? We don't want to be shifting our greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from other areas by policy interventions in one place and going to another. This is called leakage, right? Instead, we want to be minimizing leakage in our policy frameworks and also thinking about the embodied carbon in our imports. So just to give one more example, this is something I also grabbed from the USDN Sustainable Consumption Toolkit website, but it's a study on, or figure that shows a study on the difference between production and consumption emissions for different at a country level, right? And you can see it varies, right? It's not uniform across all countries, and it can really matter, right? Like look at Norway, right? From a production perspective, it's relatively low, and then once you add in additional consumption, it's quite high, right? And this is on a per capita perspective. So your consumption-based emissions can matter a lot. So we've thought a bit about how to do this in future iterations of climate action planning work or in greenhouse gas inventorying work for Hawaii. And I'm struggling with how to actually make this happen for our place, right? So not to get too technical, but a lot of times this approach is estimated based on what's called input-output models, right? And in order to do that, you need to know what are the kind of types of all of your imports and how are they consumed. And we just frankly, as an island economy, lack this data. It actually seems like it should be easier because our borders are very, they're not porous, they're very defined, and we should have this data really strictly, but we don't. It's something that I've been trying to get my hands on, and it's a challenge, right? So data availability is a really big question on how to do this in any kind of robust way. And you really do need to know, like, what are your imports? What are their quantities or their values, or ideally both, right? And so that would be kind of our big data challenge here that I'm hoping to overcome so that we can do this in a more robust way. The other thing people do a lot in consumption-based inventories is take like the larger jurisdictional area where there might be data, right? And then scale it down to a smaller, to like maybe a municipal area or a city area, right? And we can't really do that for an island state like Hawaii, right? Because our characteristics are just going to be so different than, for example, the US as a whole, right? Taking this figure of the US as a whole and then just scaling it to Hawaii's population is maybe illustrative just for educational purposes so people know there are consumption-based emissions, but certainly incorrect, right? In terms of how many consumption-based emissions. So again, these are kinds of some of the things that we're working through as we go through further iterations of inventory work and climate action planning work, which is what I want to talk about next. So one of the things that my research group at the university does is work with our local decision makers to develop models, develop tools, to engage with communities, to think about, what are our greenhouse gas emissions and how do we reduce them and what kinds of actions do we want to take? So this was the first ever climate action plan that the city and county of Honolulu put out. It's a plan that is actually very close to being kind of out of date, right? We put it out in 2020. It was kind of right during COVID. You can see people are biking with masks on still in this photo, right? And it's a 5-year plan, but it's a 5-year plan of actions really looking forward to that carbon net negative goal in 2045. So we did all of the kind of technical modeling for this work, and we really thought about the entire slice of greenhouse gas emissions for all sectors, right? And really focusing on what does the city have the jurisdiction to do? Where can the city really move the needle? And so a lot of these strategies are around land use and ground transportation, right? How do we reduce our vehicle miles traveled? How do we switch the types of vehicles we drive, particularly around our bus fleets? How do we make sure the city's playing a good role in meeting our renewable energy goals for electrification by, making sure permits are moving, making sure there's really good land use planning. And then if you look at strategies 8 and 9, it's also the city really has a lot of influence on waste prevention, as well as what we're calling waste as a resource, right? Maximizing waste resource efficiency. So this is really where we're getting at, implicitly getting at these consumption-based emissions, as well as figuring out how do we close some of these loops for a more circular economy. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what's in this plan and where does Oahu's, what does Oahu's waste sector look like? This is a solid waste, and kind of where is our waste coming from? This is a tonnage perspective between the residential sector and the commercial sector. And you can see that, a huge portion of it is organic waste, right? Other organics and food waste. To a lesser extent, we have metals and then plastic, and then construction and demo materials. And as you can see, the composition of waste really does differ quite a bit by sector, which also suggests sort of different policy approaches, right? And from a greenhouse gas perspective, we really worry when we think about the waste stream and greenhouse gas emissions. It's really about managing methane, right? Which is a really high global warming potential gas. So when we're digging into this and really learning about our waste system for this plan, one of the things I was struck by was actually our system's fairly circular as it is. There's things that we could improve, right? We actually came up with a solid list of actions to improve. But it was pretty circular as it is. So we have almost all of our waste being diverted, all of what was landfill waste being diverted to H-Power, which is our waste to energy plant for electricity generation. A huge amount of this commercial food waste is currently sent to a piggery, right? A fairly large piggery which also has a methane problem, but that's a different. So we could talk about that later. As an input there, and from our wastewater sector, there is actually, which is not shown in this figure, sorry, but our wastewater sector actually has. We produce. Oh my gosh, I'm having such a word stop here. Fertilizer, excuse me. We produce fertilizer from the outputs of our wastewater sector that is used in our city parks. So there are things we could do to close those loops even further, but there were really good elements to start. Okay, so it's kind of keeping going with where does our waste go? So only 7% of our waste goes to our landfill currently. And the 7% it's actually, it's mainly the ash from H-Power that is then landfilled. So it's very inert. So that does not produce methane when because it really just doesn't decompose, which is a different issue with it. But from a greenhouse gas perspective, a good thing. And whenever H-Power is shuttered for maintenance, then this is when we start to get some landfill waste. But it's a very small part of the waste stream at this point. There is about 30%, sorry. So 35% is sent to recycling facilities, which are out of state. We do not have any recycling facilities in the state. So the big question of, is this actually getting recycled, right? I could trace this to, most of our things are sent to California. Almost certainly they're not actually being processed in California. They're being sent on. Where they're being sent on, I could no longer trace, right? So that is a big question mark. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we developed a first order decay model for our landfills. And this was based on what we know our landfill composition was like, calibrated to the year 2015. And then moving forward, right? So of course, with greenhouse gas and with landfill waste, if we were sending the waste we were sending to the landfills before H-Power was built, of course, is still degrading, and that is causing methane, but it's also decaying, right? And so the time elements in waste landfilling to greenhouse gas emissions is a huge gap, right? And so the first order decay model captures that gap, as well as the fact that it's decaying and we're not also adding a lot of additional landfill waste there. And so that's where we're seeing the largest reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions projections for the waste sector over time. The other place that our greenhouse gas emissions come from in the waste sector is H-Power itself, right? Is in the waste to energy process. Based on greenhouse gas kind of inventory protocols, biogenic emissions are considered to be zero in this process, right? So if you grow an apple and then burn the apple, it's considered to be neutral. That is very, people argue about that, right? So we showed it both ways. We did show the biogenic emissions that are there. And we also showed the non-biogenic emissions. So this is based on like waste audits where we had the composition of types of waste. So the non-biogenic emissions would be anything else, right? Anything like plastics that are being burned in H-Power are going to be the non-biogenic emissions. So whether and how we count the biogenic emissions is, as I said, contested, but we do have it measured. From an inventory perspective, it's not included. The city has a goal of reducing our waste stream by 20% per capita. And so that yellow line is our estimate of what that looks like in terms of emissions. The kind of interesting thing about doing this planning, this climate action plan and putting all the sectors together, right, is like, how do you think about the timing of this? Because compared to fossil fuels, H-Power is a much, much lower greenhouse gas intensity. So actually, there was a lot of kind of interesting conversation around we don't want to encourage waste, right? And we don't want to increase H-Power's capacity at the same time as given some of the holdups in our solar projects, for example, is that like, how do we think about the timing of those two elements, right? So these are the actions. We have seven actions that the city committed to on waste prevention and 4 actions that the city committed to on maximizing waste as a resource. And I know this is kind of a busy word slide, but I'll just kind of give you a flavor, right? So this is really around continuing. The city's had a lot of good work on banning single-use plastics within restaurants and within takeout places. And so there's further actions that they could take in this space. Also thinking about what can the city do in its own procurement policies related to low greenhouse gas procurement of materials. Things around edible food recovery, even though, as I said, that in general, there was a feeling that we're doing okay here, there was still a space to think about edible food recovery, particularly from the commercial sector, and better ways to use some of that resource. Advanced development of a volume-based residential refuse pickup program. So this would make people think a little bit about the kinds of, do you buy on Amazon every day with a brand new package, right? Those kinds of things about residential refuse. Things around public drinking water fountains, and then limiting plastic bottles, right? And deconstruction reuse programs and recycling programs. And lastly, a lot of concern around end-of-life requirements for all of the solar PV that's also being put in. So thinking ahead on that. In terms of waste as a resource, the 4 commitments were around looking at methane collection systems at the landfill and wastewater treatment facilities. In particular, this was really viable at our wastewater treatment facilities and could be scaled up tremendously. So right now the methane is being flared. So from a greenhouse gas perspective, that is, management, but it's not the most efficient management, right? We're wasting that methane resource versus using it maybe on site. As an example. And whether it's that's a greenhouse gas reducing action really depends on what kind of energy it's displacing, right? So ideally, we'd want that to be displacing fossil energy. And at this point, it would be. Exploring the feasibility of anaerobic digester capacity. Similarly, within our solid waste and wastewater processing treatment infrastructure, this seems also like something the city very much could get going. Doing a little bit more on like a kind of analysis on greenhouse gas emissions between out-of-state recycling and H-Power, right? Especially with, tracing through what's actually being recycled and where it's going, and maybe the types of plastics that are being shipped out of state versus H-Power is a question. And then public-private partnerships to look at food diversion programs, and then increasing composting. So this is actually something the city has taken quite a bit of action on and has passed an ordinance to have residential food waste composting. That'll go into effect next year, which is great. Okay, so in conclusion, just a few thoughts. Hawaii's production of greenhouse gas emissions, it's a huge energy sector issue, right? So reducing fossil fuel usage is absolutely critical to meeting the climate crisis. Waste sector greenhouse gas emissions are 2% of Hawaii's production-based emissions, but this is, we know, much, much larger if you take a consumption-based approach. And as I said, we're hoping to be able to do some of that work and get into that data. We have achieved considerable landfill diversion through H-Power, and landfill emissions because of this are expected to decline by almost 2/3 by 2045 from 2015 levels. So this is very good news in terms of our landfill methane emissions. And that means that most of our emissions are actually now occurring in waste to energy, right? And so how do we want to think about that and manage that? So if we think about the waste stream reduction actions that the city committed to, right, we can, it's easy to be like, oh, it's only 2%. We don't need to do that, right? But the truth is as I said, it's 2%, but that's only what we're measuring. It's actually much larger, right? And so if we think about this as a global pollutant, the actions that we take here have global effect. And that's true everywhere, right? So when we think about waste stream reduction, it's really important from thinking about the interconnectedness of these systems. And that's where I think some of these kind of municipal policy tools are both important, but are also, kind of lacking in feeling like they're going to do something big, right? And that's where we really, really do need broader policy interventions. So to me, the most important thing is carbon pricing at an international scale, like we discussed, in terms of if we did have that, then production-based inventorying would be functional, right? Accounting and reductions. And in lieu of that, having border carbon adjustments, right? So if you have a carbon pricing system nationally, or even at a state level in the US, we cannot have a border carbon adjustment. That would be a violation of interstate commerce. So this really does have to, in the US context, happen at a national level. But you can think about, if there was national carbon pricing and a border carbon adjustment, that would be such a powerful tool to address consumption-based emissions coming into the US boundaries. This, of course, is what the EU is pursuing, right? So expanding these kinds of policy tools are absolutely critical for both reducing fossil fuel consumption and embodied emission within our waste streams. So with that, I will stop sharing. Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing the panelists' comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Coffman, for your insightful talk about climate action planning and circular waste management for an island economy. Now we will shortly move to the panel discussion session. Before that, we have a polite request to all our attendees. We would like to capture a group photo with all of you at the end of the panel discussion. So to ensure everyone's videos are visible, we need to promote each of you to a panelist role. So we will assist you in promoting towards the end of the session for the group photo, and we kindly request your cooperation and understanding. Thank you very much, everyone. And now let's proceed to the panel discussion. Allow me to introduce our panel members for today's session. We have Professor Alex Godoy today, who is the Director of the Sustainability Research Center and Strategic Resource Management at University del Desarrollo. He is one of our previous speakers for this lecture series. And we have Professor Brendan Byatt, who is a professor at the Osaka University Center for Global Initiatives in Japan. We also have Ms. Amelia Lee-Weasley, who is currently completing her PhD on multi-level waste governance in Australian cities at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. Now we will get started with the panel discussion. The panel discussion will go for about 20 minutes, and we also request our attendees to post their questions freely to the chat box or raise their hands using the raise hand function on Zoom to ask the questions to the panel or discuss something with them directly. Professor Coffman, over to you again.
Thank you. So is it okay if we sort of go down the panel and panelists and have comments? All right, Brendan, I'm going to call on you first.
Okay, thank you very much, Makena. That was a very interesting presentation. And also I think Hawaii is an excellent case study in terms of the challenges posed by climate action planning. The first thing that struck me is how to set the boundaries for the climate action plan. And I note that the one you shared was for Oahu, but not for the entire state of Hawaii. So I'm a little bit curious about who is setting the boundaries and what kind of conversation takes place around that, because I think it also relates to the bigger argument that you have about the what emissions are captured and addressed in a climate action plan, and where do you make a decision to draw that? So I'm very curious at what point in the process you also decided you wouldn't tackle consumption emissions or address them even in the Oahu plan. I think, I see that the Portland, Oregon was pointing, it was in 2011 that they were addressing consumption emissions. And then when you were making your plan, you made a decision at some point not to address those. And I know you had some reasoning behind that, but you could have put that reasoning into the plan and said, actually, this is a very important issue and we need to address it at some stage. So I think that boundary question and who makes decisions is really important. And I wonder what it means for your next plan. Are you going to completely change your approach and how you address emissions in general, both sector-based and the consumption-based? Are you going to try to tackle that? And also, is there any attempt to do a more sort of holistic plan for the entire state? So maybe I should leave my comments there for now, because those are pretty big ones. And I don't want to try to steal all the glory by addressing lots of issues. But I think that the challenge that you face is that you're also part of the planning process. So you're inside, which makes it also very difficult for you to be able to critique it and say, actually, you know what, here are 10 things that are really bad about this plan. But maybe we can do that a little bit from our position. But anyway, that's my first comment.
Thanks, Brendan. I think because that's a big one, I'm going to jump in and respond to it, and then we'll go down to Alex and Amelia, if that's okay. So this question of how to set the boundaries is so important and so difficult. So I'll say the boundaries were legally set, legislatively set through a couple major acts at the state level in Hawaii. So the first was Act 234, which was set in 2007. And that basically said, we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This was, 2007, a while ago. So it was like, well, by 2020, to 1990 levels by 2020, excluding aviation emissions. Right. So that I was very highly critical of. It was like, no, we really shouldn't exclude this. This seems like it should absolutely be included. And it was excluded because of lobbying efforts, right, from the aviation industry. That said, in hindsight, it was really interesting, right? Because on paper, it was like, absolutely, they shouldn't be excluded. They should be included. But it turns out that in that time period, there was like a wholesale change out of Hawaii's airline fleets to these much more efficient jets going over the Pacific. So had Hawaii included aviation, it actually would have been met like many years earlier, ironically, right? So, and then the other part about it is it was a bad policy to begin with because it was only in the year 2020. And then there was a global pandemic in the year 2020. So it didn't really, obviously we met it. That said, it got us measuring our emissions. And that was actually the important thing, right? So kind of the details of what was included or not included versus all of that ended up being, or the compliance here, all of that ended up being sort of irrelevant in comparison to getting us going on measuring it and getting better at measuring it over time. And that's what started these greenhouse gas inventories that you see that I showed earlier, right? And so now so this idea that aviation is excluded still sort of stays, except that we still measure it. Right. So we still have transparency in that. The carbon net negative language actually does include aviation. But the interesting thing there is it only allows for offsets in Hawaii's boundaries is kind of the language within our carbon net negative. Right. So again, it's a different set of like, what do you measure and what is counted and who are the boundaries? And so that's a kind of a different presentation, but the offset markets that are starting to kind of conversations and markets that are starting to occur here makes that very interesting and a little bit tricky. So the consumption-based inventory aspects, right, as I said, they're very important. And I'm really on the fence about this because the fact of the matter is we just don't have the data. So my view is I could probably spend 20 minutes with Canva and make a better picture and more illustrative educational picture of what consumption-based inventory emissions are for Hawaii than if I spent 6 months digging through data that does not exist and then making something up and pretending like I had confidence in the numbers, right? That's, I think, a huge challenge. So if there was the data, if we really knew the volume of imports by sector within our input-output table, so we have a really good input-output table, actually. We have a 68 by 68 matrix of sectors, and we really, really know what goes into each sector by sector in Hawaii, but we really don't have data on our imports. So again, if we knew that, then I think the consumption-based inventory would be a great thing and be worth spending time on, but we don't. And so it's a little bit like, let's fix the data problem first. And then the second part of that is, if we had the information, what could we do about it, right? One, there's definitely educational things we could do about it. And I think that would be very powerful. So that's a reason to do it. Absolutely. Legislatively, as a state, it's really difficult, right? This is why I ended with national policy and border carbon adjustment policy, because that's what we really need to move consumption-based emissions, at least within the US kind of framework. So, yeah. So do you want to respond at all, Brendan, or?
No, I mean, you could take a look at what San Francisco has been doing. I think they actually have done a very detailed inventory.
I've read that.
Okay.
Yeah, I have. We just don't have that data.
Aren't they focusing on, yeah, that's the other problem, is making data available and assumptions transparent. But I think they actually focused on consumer spending patterns. Yeah. Household level consumer spending patterns. So that's maybe another thing you could look at. And there may be other models out there. I think it's just a matter of trying to look at who's doing the best work on this and what you can employ. But perhaps we can go to another panelist now.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to say, so the San Francisco model is very interesting. It's basically consumer spending patterns, and they times it by a national emissions coefficient. Right. So if you think your production factor is the same as the national per consumption type, it might be, as I said, that could be where it makes sense. So that actually data wise we could do. Let's go to Alex.
Yes, and again, Professor Coffman, an amazing presentation, because it's a very specific case about the Hawaii. But I have too many questions because you know, and you live in the United States. The United States is a very special country into the Paris Agreement. You mentioned the carbon adjustment mechanism, something like that. Is very controversial in Europe, because right now I don't know if a carbon taxes or a fee. Nobody knows. Okay, my question for you is, I have one specific question about the policy package, because for one side your presentation was about the mitigation and the role by the overlapping between consumption or sustainable consumption or responsible consumption and production for one side. For another side is waste production and how we can recover materials or convert or recover energy and materials. Okay, and how we can reduce the fuel oils by using recovering energy, maybe converting in hydrogen. You know, is the next step. But my question is about the policy package and the level of the policy package, because Hawaii is, in my opinion, is a local policy. How you can keep the coherence between Hawaii, the state, and another state, national level and global level, because finally we are talking about not just technology, we are talking about the fundings, regulation, restriction, how you can integrate Hawaii with another state, the cross borders of the wastes, because you mentioned that too many wastes is out of the state, and you have transport and carbon footprint by transport of the wastes, so on. So this is a complex systems. So can you explain me how we can and manage this complexity between local policies, state policies, national policies, policy package, and merging the mitigation strategy and adaptation as well? Because you never talk about adaptation, but I know that Hawaii is suffering and too many hazards from the weather. So, can you explain me the complexity? Why? Because I come from Chile, and we are one of the most vulnerable countries suffering too many extreme events and our climate. We need to advance in mitigation and adaptation as well. And finally, is the just one funding, no? Or you're investing in mitigation, or you're investing in adaptation. How we can explain this complexity? How is the play of the different stakeholders, agencies to deploy the more proper climate policy? And thank you, because it's very interesting how you can create this overlapping between local and state and national level.
No, thanks, Alex. That's a great and huge question. So I'll try to do my best and pare it down. So this issue of basically multi-level governance, right? We have overlapping jurisdictions. I mean, this is common across many countries, and certainly within the US, basically within the state federalist framework, it's huge, right? Hugely important. We have the things that the federal government does and preempts states, does not allow states to do. And then we have things that are the responsibilities of states, but also in many cases, the responsibility of municipalities, right? And they all overlap within this climate space. Let's focus on in mitigation and adaptation, right? I actually do work a lot in sea level rise adaptation as well. And so talk endlessly about that for Hawaii as well. But so let's take ground transportation, right? Because it's probably the best and the best, most straightforward sort of showcasing of why this is complicated within levels of governance, right? So within the US, it's the federal government who regulates fuel economy standards. And they do not allow states to do this, right? States are preempted. They are told absolutely not. California, of course, has more power than the rest of the states from this perspective. And so in the Obama administration, California said, we're going to regulate our own fuel economy standards because you guys aren't moving fast enough. And the Obama administration did not preempt California because they didn't want to do that. But what they did was they moved the rest of the country to what California wanted to do. So they still kept the federal standard, which is a really important governance thing, right? And California was given a waiver to fuel economy such that they could go further, and other states who are out of compliance with the Clean Air Act can also follow California. But at the end of the day, it all gets put into the national average of fuel economy. So it's still a nationally harmonized policy, right? And what that means is that you can have, as the electric vehicle market focuses on California and the other non-compliant ZEV states for electric vehicle sales, and then they actually can sell fewer in other states because it's averaged in the end, which is very frustrating. Okay, so that's like the kinds of cars we buy, right? Very, very federally controlled. But the roads you drive on are paid for federally, but then built by the state and county, right? And so that's like how far you go, right? The type of land use, your vehicle miles traveled, what you do spending your day going from here to there, right? Are you going to walk or are you going to take your car, right? And so the interplay between what the counties do, for example, in terms of building, pedestrian safe cities, right? Or bike safe cities is really, really interactive to the kinds of cars we drive, right? And that's federal. And so again, this interplay is really, really important. I think this is why I go back to the importance of pricing, right? It'd be nice if we could sort of work this all out on a quantity basis per sector, but we really can't because it's so complex, right? But if we had a national pricing scheme for carbon, then suddenly our incentives are much more aligned federally and locally. And so, and then you can start to get to the international components of that. So I still, it's not the end all be all policy. You have to do so much more, right? You can price carbon, but then if you don't provide public transit, it's a very, very, regressive policy. So you need to be doing both, right? Solving for multiple market failures. But I still fail to figure out what is that policy thread that can pull these multiple layers of government together other than carbon pricing. This policy package idea is really important, particularly again, in the US context. I think there was a moment where everybody thought that there was a moment of the Western Climate Initiative where really there was momentum around California's carbon market, and people really felt like there was going to be a lot of states joining the Western Climate Initiative and launching in California's cap and trade system, right? Because of the 2009 financial crisis, that really, and maybe other reasons too, but certainly that failed to come into fruition. And so now people are really sitting wondering, should we do our own price, right? Like Washington State they're doing that right now, or should we join with California? Should we harmonize? And, right now California is linked to Quebec, right? So it doesn't have to be just states. Again, these are kind of the decision points that states are made. And a separate study we did for the state a couple of years ago, we looked at the economic and greenhouse gas impacts of carbon pricing programs for Hawaii and also the administrative considerations. And we strongly recommended that Hawaii actually just have a tax. They could harmonize the tax rate to California's cap and trade, but just straight up tax, but not try to join into WCI.
Just let me ask an uncomfortable question.
Yeah.
The carbon pricing is very controversial, like you say. Indeed, one paper 2 weeks ago appears in Science about the climate policies around the world, and just maybe a few policies are the more successful policy, and one of them is carbon taxes. And the taxes always is controversial because it's a very, very regressive strategy. So yesterday we had the debate between representative of the Republicans and Democrats. For one side, according to the IPCC, the most successful strategy to try to protect the climate policies is the institutionalization of the policies, and maybe try to create a big legal framework like climate policy law or climate law or something like that. Because finally, the problem is not the policies, the politics. And in your opinion, and how we can reduce the political influence to try to protect some specific successful policies, and that depend of the political cycle finally. This is the same for Brazil, Bolsonaro and Lula right now, or Argentina before Fernandez, and right now Milei. Or in Chile is different. We are very conservative throughout the administration, but it's very common in South America and another part of the Europe. Indeed, France and Italy, the extreme right parties are fighting against of the climate regulation. So how we can protect at local level and the political influence and the political pendulum indeed.
Oh boy, if I actually knew the answer to that, then, solving the climate crisis would be a lot easier. I don't know the answer to that. That's really hard, right? Because, okay, so I'll tell you a bunch of answers that may or may not, right, that I think people consider. So, one of the things against sort of like a centralized national program, as you rightly say, is that, the next administration comes in and it's just done away with, right? And this is the logic of a buckshot approach, right? Instead, you put a million different climate policies at all different levels of governance and have them all sort of stick. And maybe by doing that, they're more durable, right? So maybe highly inefficient, potentially. Most research suggests that's incredibly inefficient, right? And therefore more costly, right? But more politically durable. And so there's a trade-off there. And is that a trade-off we're willing to make? Maybe, at this point, sure. Me personally, sure. But again, that is a trade-off, right? I think one of the misunderstandings about carbon pricing is that it's always regressive. It's not always regressive, right? All of the research on carbon pricing within the US context is because owners of capital of fossil fuel are high income. It's actually quite progressive, right? It tends to be a progressive policy in the US context with the US kind of owners of capital. So that was a question we had for how does this pencil out in Hawaii? We actually found that carbon pricing alone was regressive because we don't have a lot of manufacturing here, right? Actually, we have almost none, right? So, but if you give those monies back to households, we found that not only is it progressive, it can actually make lower income households better off than without the policy, economically, financially better off. And that was a puzzling result that we had. This paper is published in Climate Policy, if anybody's interested. But the reason was pretty simple. It was actually just because we have so many tourists paying into the carbon revenue pot. So when you give those monies back to households, it can make them economically better off. So there are ways to design these policies that make them hopefully less controversial. Of course, the word tax people just sort of don't like, but like once you give monies back to households, presumably the assumption is that that becomes a more durable policy as well, right? So I don't have the answers, but those are some thoughts.
Thank
I
you.
think I'll just jump in if that's all right. I'm cognizant
Yes, I
that
think
we've
it's
got
your turn.
1
Go
minute
for it,
left.
Makena. Yes.
So I thought, Makena, if it's all right with you, instead of asking questions, I might just bring some reflections from the Australian context that are super relevant to your very interesting presentation. So as mentioned, I study multi-level waste governance in Australia, looking at climate overlap. So this is a very kind of like relevant talk to me. So thank you so much for sharing your insights from Hawaii. A couple of things just on the waste as a climate mitigation strategy and this like focus on emissions. I thought it was quite interesting. The heavy reliance on waste to energy as a management tool for residual waste, the stuff that can't be recycled in Australia and this state at the moment where we don't have a lot of investment in waste to energy facilities, but we're running out of landfill space. And there's this really interesting debate locally about whether investing in such infrastructure will actually lock us into ongoing waste production, which is obviously locking us into ongoing emissions production, and this sort of bigger question around waste prevention as the focus, and then emission, waste to energy as a sort of perhaps necessary transition technology, but not the kind of be all and end all solution. But it's quite interesting to see other contexts where waste to energy is obviously plays such a big role and is still considered kind of an emissions burden. Even though it's sort of, creating energy as well. So it's an interesting kind of tension there. But I just want to touch on that kind of waste as adaptation as well, because that's something I'm personally very interested in and something I sort of consider a bit undercooked internationally and even locally. People don't really see waste as a climate adaptation issue directly. Often it'll be, sea level rise, storm surge, flooding, fires in Australia is a big issue for us. But often waste, when it ends up in the environment as a result of poor management, so when it's not sort of collected and, sort of allocated to different streams, it becomes an adaptation issue when it clogs streams, for example. It can cause flooding. It's also a big health risk. When we have a lot of organic waste lying around, it can, or, landfills that leak can contaminate local soils and lead to kind of health impacts in neighbouring communities, particularly in the global south. We're seeing that's a huge issue. So it's just kind of interesting overlap, and I was sort of interested to see that